Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Monstera Albo and everything you need to know to be able to grow this beautiful houseplant in your home. The Monstera Albo is directly related to the Monstera Deliciosa, which has been a popular houseplant for well over 50 years. And the reason that was so popular was because it's so easy to look after and it looks absolutely immense when it gets going with those leaves. So there's no surprise that the Monstera Albo gives a new touch to this by having the variegation on the leaves. It is beautiful. The price of this plant was really expensive. It has come down a lot now, but it is still quite pricey. So you may be thinking that the reason for the price is because it's quite difficult and a hard plant to care for, but that isn't true. Okay, so it's a little bit different, little bit more difficult than the Monstera Deliciosa, but not by much. It's still really easy. It's one of the most simplest houseplants I've ever grown. There are a few things that you need to do to get the most out of this plant, which we're going to cover in detail as we go. So let's get started. As with most of my videos, let's just get started with the light. So it needs quite a bright location to do it at its best. It can cope with medium light levels, but it won't perform as well as unless you can find a really bright location for it. It doesn't like full sun, okay? You could get away with a few hours of sunshine in the early morning or potentially late evening, but it is borderline. You need to watch for the leaves, especially with the variegation. It can burn very easily. The best place you can find for it is the brightest spot you have that doesn't get direct sunlight. That's what you need to be aiming for. A lot of people will use grow lights to grow their rare house plants. It's like the Monstera Albo. But is it essential? The answer to that is no. So a grow light will absolutely help you to grow your house plant in situations where ordinarily it would stop growing, such as winter. What I do is I do supplement my plant with grow light and it will continue to grow well into December, but ordinarily it would stop maybe around October time. So what you'll find is if you don't use a grow light, it would just slow down as you head into the winter months. That's not necessarily a problem and it will resume again in spring. But if you want the plant to grow faster and bigger, then a grow light absolutely could help you, but you don't have to have one to grow these plants. So watering is something else you need to get right with these plants. Fortunately, it is a trait which is shared with many other houseplants in that they just prefer to be watered well and then allowed to dry out by a couple of inches on the top before you water them again. How often that will take, how often you'll need to water it again after it's dried out will depend on your environmental conditions. For example, if it's summer, it's going to dry out a lot quicker than if it's winter because it's warmer, there's more light around. In winter, it's colder, there's less light. There's going to be lots of different variables that determine how that is. It's really important that you get it right though, because if you underwater these plants, problems can occur, and if you overwater them, you can cause serious issues with them as well. So you need to get it right. Fortunately, there's a couple of things that you can do to help you with this, and that is clear pots and also a moisture meter. A moisture meter is a great thing to use if you're just starting out with these plants and you just want to get an idea of how damp the potting mix is. You just simply go into the potting mix and it will give you a reading. You do need to be careful. Sometimes they can give you incorrect readings. If the sensor was to hit a dry area of the potting mix, it could tell you it needs to be watered when the rest of it could actually be quite damp. So you do need to use common sense. But they are a little bit easier going on the plant than sticking your fingers in them all the time and having to feel that way. The other thing you might want to consider as well is clear pots. A lot of people who grow these plants enjoy and use clear pots because for two reasons. One, you can have a look at the root health. You're able to see how the roots are doing. Are they filling the container? Does it need to be repotted, for example? But also it lets you see how damp the potting mix is as well. You can simply see, just by looking, if it needs to be watered or not. So they're really helpful. You don't have to use a clear pot, so don't think that's what I'm saying to you. They can just be useful, especially if you're new to these plants and you want to avoid overwatering mistakes. Now, something else that's quite unique about Monstera, especially the Monstera Albo, is the growing support. They really ideally need one in order to perform at their best. In their native habitat, they are actually growing up other trees or other tall sort of vegetation. They grow up it in order to reach the upper canopies. They're jungle plants, tropical plants, so they're quite dark and it's low light. They want to climb up. They want to get to the higher light level, so they will clamber up other plants. You need to replicate that indoors in order to get the same results. When these aerial roots come out and they are satisfied and they're comfortable in what they're holding on to, the leaves get bigger. The leaves will fenestrate, they will produce the splits. That is so iconic for the Monstera plant. If there are no aerial roots, if they can't grip hold of something, you don't get those splits or those fenestration. If you have a really small one, a very young plant, you don't need a support immediately, but you're going to have to think about getting one in the next year or two. Now, Sometimes you'll buy these plants and they will come with a support already, or you'll just go out and you'll just buy one from a normal store, and they look usually a bit like this, a coconut totem or something along those lines. Now, it may work, okay, but I don't recommend them. I don't think they're the best. The aerial roots will absorb water and moisture once they've gripped into something. You can't do this with these type of poles. All that they can do is sort of grow on them, but they can't get into them because it's quite difficult for them to grow into it. So I don't recommend these. You could get a normal sort of pole which you make yourself. They tend to be quite small. My recommendation, what I use for all my climbing sort of plants like this, is D-supports. They come in a plastic like this, and then you just make them yourself at home, okay? And then you'd fill it with sphagnum moss. It's that simple. And they love it, okay? The aerial roots, I'm going to show you some footage. The aerial roots just go all the way through. They are literally thriving in there. It's just what they want. And as a result, the plant gets bigger and bigger and bigger, more splits and fenestrations. So D-support is my recommendation. You may get away with something else. It's trial and error. You need to try it. If you're interested, I'll link below to something that I buy and you can have a look at them. But they are quite standard. You should be able to get them in most places. Not too expensive, just a little bit fiddly. But they are modular as well. So as your plant gets taller and taller, you can just add a new one on top. So it's really easy and straightforward. Pot and mix is really important for these plants, and repotting as well. So let's cover those two issues now. So they don't need to be repotted on a constant basis. You do need to repot them, yes, absolutely, especially when they're small. And if you've got a very small plant to start with, you're going to probably look to repot it maybe once every year or so until it gets to more like a size like this. If you're using a growing support as well, then they can be repotted a bit less frequently because the aerial roots are growing into the, say, sphagnum moss that you're using. So there's a little bit more space that they don't need for the roots in the actual potting mix. So once they get to a mature size, you can probably maybe look to repot them once every 3 years or so. It's generally speaking when the potting mix starts to break down, which is when you should really consider repotting, when they get to a larger size. In terms of the potting mix itself, absolutely yes, that's really important. They need an aerated sort of potting mix. They don't want it really condensed. They don't want it heavy. They don't want it to be compacted. So your everyday garden compost or soil is probably not going to be suitable here. You may get away with using that, but you're going to have to add amendments into it to try and keep it more open. We're talking things like coconut coir, perlite, maybe a little bit of grit if you're getting desperate. Something like that to keep it really chunky is what they're looking for, and that's when you'll get the best results. Like I say, keep it open. If you allow it to be condensed and a very heavy potting mix, you're going to increase the chances of rotting and overwatering and problems like that. The roots need air in order to breathe. So aim for those things and you should have no problems. Okay, so in terms of humidity, there are tropical plants. They are going to prefer it to be humid where you're growing them. They can deal with slightly lower levels. They don't need high humidity specifically. What you're going to need is around 50% plus, ideally 60% or more for most of the time that you're growing them, and that should be absolutely fine. If the humidity level drops to low levels, you may notice more specifically browning on the white variegation. It's more susceptible to that. It's going to vary. You're down 50% is probably the lowest you want to head towards, and if you do notice a lot of browning, you may need to try and increase that humidity levels. I don't have much browning on mine because my humidity levels are around 60% for most of the year, so I'm quite fortunate in that regard. So I can say 60% is the aim for me, and it works. In terms of temperature, they are, again, tropical plants that like it warm. Okay, they want it warm. They want warm temperatures. They don't grow if the temperature is regularly below 18 degrees Celsius, which is this much Fahrenheit. And you don't want to go much lower than that generally anyway, because they just don't like it. They don't like the cold. They like it warm. That's what they're aiming for. So as hot as possible, generally speaking, is what you should go for. They're not succulents. They're not desert plants. So they don't need extremely high temperature, but just really comfortable living conditions is probably going to be absolutely fine for these. In terms of feeding, absolutely, yes, you do need to feed these plants. They have massive leaves that need to be supported, and you do need to feed them. We're looking at maybe doing it once a month, perhaps, just a regular houseplant feed, or you can go for one which maybe has a little bit more nitrogen in it to encourage the growth of the leaves. But yeah, do feed your plants, especially when they're growing as well. When they're in active growth, when leaves are coming out, give them a feed, and you should see some benefits from that. Okay, so that's the essential care for growing the Monstera Albo. I hope if you have just bought your plant, you're not too nervous. I hope my experiences have helped maybe reassure you slightly. They are really straightforward houseplants and they are quite easy. You just a little bit moderate difficulty perhaps, but generally on the easier side overall, I'd say. So don't be scared of them and just have a good time growing them. Don't fuss them too much. Let them do their thing and just enjoy them. They are beautiful, beautiful houseplants. You may still come across problems and issues. So what I would do in the future is another video covering those topics. So give you a helping hand there. But in the meantime, I do really appreciate you watching this video, and thanks again. And I hope to see you in the next one.